using radio in Class G airspace, and it's sort of focused around phrases and telephony. Now, the webinar will be recorded this morning and it'll be made available on the pilot safety hub that CASA has recently commissioned, and if you go into that you'll see there'll be a major topic on operations and uncontrolled aerodromes, and the recording and other recordings from previous webinars and subsequent webinars will also be available there for you to have a look at your leisure. So all your microphones and cameras have been disabled now, we think, but there'll be opportunity at the end of the session to ask questions and have them answered. You can either ask a general question or you can direct a question at a specific subject matter expert, and I'll introduce the panel members in a moment. Alternatively, through the presentation this morning, if you have a question you'd like answered, you can type it into the chat room, and one of us will respond to you in that manner and hopefully resolve your query in that regard. So that's general format for this morning. We'll run through the presentation and then we'll go into a question and answer session towards the end. The seminar is designed to or developed to go for around about 30-40 minutes. It's designed to be reasonably quick, given everybody is time committed these days, but that doesn't mean that we can't continue if we're having some good chat about some technical points of operating around an uncontrolled aerodrome. So that's the format for the for this morning. So this is a series, the first of a series of 4 seminars. So we'll be exploring things like, does your radio calls or do your radio calls improve your situational awareness, which they're designed to do, or do they merely congest the frequency? It's important to know what calls are mandatory and what calls might be recommended. And doing things like checking you're on the correct frequency, and of course using things like standard phraseology. So as mentioned, this is the first of 4 of these events focusing on operations at uncontrolled aerodromes, and throughout the series of 4 you'll hear from different subject matter experts about their perspectives and their experiences operating around uncontrolled aerodromes. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, I'll introduce the seminar subject matter experts, introducing myself first. I'm an aviation safety advisor. I'm the current team leader of the ASA team. I work in the Melbourne office in Docklands in Melbourne. I have with me today, unfortunately, Neil Bogue, I should say, Flight Standards Manager of RMIT University at Point Cook, can't be with us this week, but Neil will be with us for the other 3 seminars in the series. We have with us Neil Schaefer of RAAus. Neil is the head of training development. We also have with us Stefan Alman. Stefan's the safety manager at Moorabbin Aviation Services and was also a flight instructor there. And lastly but not least, we have Terry Horsam with us. Terry is my colleague, aviation safety advisor, and Terry works from the Adelaide office in Canberra. So that's our panel for this morning. So let's start with maintaining good radio procedures. So we've got some points here that are really the basic or the fundamental practices that you might comply with to be able to effectively communicate, which is an important concept in aviation. A lot of our information comes through radio broadcasting over the correct and appropriate frequency, and without that we're left with quite a hole in the technical information or operational information that we might require to make decisions about our particular flight. So we need to look at things like setting frequencies early, being familiar with the aerodrome layout, and that makes quite a big difference in terms of knowing your taxi routes out for the runway for departure, your taxi routes inbound to parking after you've landed, which are have a close association for where you might broadcast and the type of information that you might give to other traffic, for example, your position on an airfield. We'll explore the practice of sterile cockpit procedure, which we'll see is a defence against things like distraction and being distracted away from making the appropriate radio call. When they're required, we'll look at things like thinking, listening, and then transmitting, rather than broadcasting and then having to think about what it is you might be wanting to say. We'll look at using standard phraseology, and we'll look at, if you're not sure, asking for clarification, be that from another pilot or from air traffic services, for example, transmitting when it's necessary, and no idle chit chat across a VHF or any aviation frequency, and above all, but not least and last, to speak clearly while we do that. So what I might do is I might start with Neil from RAAus and say, Neil, does RAAus apply the concept of a sterile cockpit procedure to guard against things like distraction?
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for putting on the series to CASA. To answer your question directly, yes, we do. Obviously, the sterile cockpit concept starts at the pre-brief, particularly with passenger flights where those people may not be familiar with aviation practices and disciplines. Clearly in dual pilot or training operations, it's absolutely important that a protocol is established, not just in terms of the instructional delivery, but the priority for building a situational map by listening and not turning down the radio, and making sure that you actually continue to remain on the correct frequency and build that map. And it's human factors tells us that the audible inputs account for about 15 to 20% of our total memory intake, with the visual being the majority. Building that audible map relies on being able to have a sterile cockpit.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Stefan, I might also go to you. Being a qualified flying instructor and a safety manager, I'm thinking that you would employ and teach the sterile cockpit procedure.
Yeah, absolutely. Just reflecting on what Neil said, yeah, it starts really from, the briefings on the ground, trying to really nail into students very early on how important it is to try and set a plan up in your head before you actually get to that 10 nautical mile point, and actually make your broadcast forming a sterile cockpit, where basically the main focus is between you and your student, or the instructor and student, or the pilot's flying, and just basically within that, pretty much from the 20 nautical mile boundary away from the aerodrome, you sort of focus purely on just what's procedurally required going into the aerodrome, and setting a plan in place before you get to that 10 nautical mile boundary, where you actually make your call and follow the procedure. But yeah, from that 20 nautical mile stage, it's pretty much a sterile cockpit focus just around the procedures entering the CTAF.
Yes, thanks, Stefan. Look, in private operations and recreational operations, there are no hard and fast rules around, when you might, in terms of policy or procedures, when you might employ a sterile cockpit procedure, but generally it would be around a terminal area, for example, on departure and on arrival, and you might keep it into place until you get to top of the climb or above a particular level, for example. And it's just a way, as we've said, of minimising those distractions so that you can focus on operating the aircraft one, and of course maintaining a good listening watch on the appropriate VHF frequency, and listening for other broadcasts that you might need to respond to. And certainly when we get into the situational awareness series of the webinars, and which are the last two, we'll see that that's quite an important concept. And I think Neil mentioned developing that mind map in terms of what is required from the aviation operation point of view. So That's
Excuse
quite
me,
all right.
Mike. Can I just
Certainly.
step? Terry Horsam here, everybody. Sorry, Mike.
Sure.
We've just
Sure.
we've just got a question from Keith, which I think is probably worthwhile addressing at the moment. It's just Keith's asked, well, what actually is a sterile cockpit? If you're happy, I'll just go ahead and explain the concept behind it,
Yeah, sure.
and then
Yep.
move from there, if you like.
Sure,
So, Keith, and for everybody else, it's actually a sterile cockpit comes from the airline industry, where the only time you're actually going to have a conversation, in an airliner, it might be something like below 10,000 feet, or in any high workload phase of flight, you're only going to ever be discussing the aspects of the flight, so anything operational. So I guess the idea there is to not discuss, the football scores when you're on a short final. So with a passenger flight and with a recreational flight, what we try and do is basically just say to the passengers, look, there's going to be occasions where I'm going to be listening on the radio, or I won't be able to speak with you. And so if that's the case, you might set up a hand gesture or something with your passengers while you're listening to a radio call. So they're not actually not necessarily interfering with you, but distracting you in a really busy circuit, for instance. So the sterile cockpit is just basically empowering your passengers to speak up when necessary. So you make sure that if they see an aircraft coming at right angles to you, you haven't seen it, certainly distract you then. But in the rest of the time, it's just, look, there's certain phases of flight, generally from the moment we start the engine to when we get into the cruise, where you're going to be quite busy. And so we'll maintain this sterile cockpit, if you like. So hopefully that explains a little bit of what that procedure actually might be. And it's just a matter of empowering your passengers to speak up when necessary, but certainly in the busy times, you might not be able to talk to them straight away. So you're basically, I suppose, managing that possible distraction within the cockpit.
Thanks, Terry. Yeah, thanks for the question, Keith. It is a good point, and because it's universally applicable, it's not just a Class G or an uncontrolled airspace or uncontrolled aerodrome procedure. It's a concept that is employed when you're operating inside controlled airspace, for example. It's just as critical and important there, and it will guard against the distraction away from, as we said, one, operating the aircraft, and two, missing calls from air traffic control, for example, and needing to respond to those. So yeah, it's a basic procedure where we tell our passengers that, short of seeing fuel gushing out of the wing or oil covering the wing, for example, or another aircraft getting extremely close to us, that all of our conversation that we had relates directly to the operation of the aircraft, for example. So thanks for that, Terry. Another critical point for maintaining good practice, practicing good radio procedure, is using standard phraseologies. So I think what we'll do is we'll move on and have a look at a standard format of a radio broadcast, for example. So you'll find this standard format in the Advisory Circular Part 91-10, and it begins with your location followed by the word traffic, then your aircraft type, your aircraft call sign, your position, and of course intentions. And lastly, you finish the broadcast by repeating the location again. So this is a standard format with standard phrases, and it's important to use this type of standard radio broadcast because it assists those who are receiving your broadcast to more easily understand it, if you like. And we'll have a look at an example at the moment. The location, of course, is primarily there to indicate where you are in terms of your position, which is quite, in terms of the location of the uncontrolled aerodrome, which is quite important for a number of different reasons. One is it's important to other traffic around that aerodrome, but quite frequently you find other uncontrolled aerodromes that are in the same common traffic advisory frequency area, if you like, and although they're different aerodromes, they share the same CTAF, so it's important to indicate your location so that other receiving pilots can work out whether your broadcast is particularly significant to them or not. So we start always by saying, here we are at this particular location, and you address the traffic that might be there. Your aircraft type. Aircraft type is important for a couple of different reasons. One of them is to assist the sighting of you. So if you say that you're a Cessna 172, that enables other pilots to search and look out for an aircraft with high wing, for example, and if they see something with a low wing, they can immediately recognise that that's not the traffic that they've just heard in the broadcast. The other critical aspect of the aircraft type is it will give the receiving pilots some indication of the performance that's likely to be had by a particular aircraft. So, for example, it might be a Cessna 172, it could be a Cessna 210, a high performance single, it could be a multi-engine aeroplane, and indeed at some aerodromes, uncontrolled aerodromes, it could be an air transport type operation, multi-engine, or even a jet operation, for example, with quite a high performance compared to the aircraft that you might be flying. Of course, you give your call sign so that if some pilot would like to respond specifically to your broadcast, that they can address you. You give your position and intentions, of course, and this is quite critical because it assists or indicates to other pilots where they might begin to scan for you in terms of your their lookout. And you finish, of course, with repeating the location, and that's important because if the beginning of the transmission is missed, you repeating that transmission at the end of the location at the end of the broadcast helps them to decide whether the call is relevant to them or not. So, Neil, I might ask you, aircraft types, they vary quite a bit in terms of their look and their performance in recreational aviation. So it's quite important for pilots to pass that type of information so they can expect, what performance that particular aircraft might be having and the impact on their particular operation. Would that be fair enough to say?
There's over 120 different types of light sport and ultralight aircraft that fly in Australian skies. So you'll hear a lot of terms and types that a lot of general aviation pilots may not be aware of. So it's important for the transmitter to make sure that they slow down the transmission. Particularly, there's a expectation bias to actually listen to an alpha, not an alphanumeric, but a 3 letters or a call sign relating to an airline. When they hear 4 numbers, it's really important that pilots use the ICAO grouping method as well as the type, and broadcasts make that part of the broadcast slow so that the receiving stations can actually interpret and understand not only the aircraft type, but also get an idea. So if they have to engage in two-way communication, they've actually been able to capture that call sign. So I think they're probably some of the unique differences. I think the important thing is it's really important when we transmit to wait and we break that squelch, so that if we clip the first initiating station identifier, where we used to use all stations in past formats, by saying the station first, it's often clipped. So when we hit the transmit button, when we push that red button, it's important to wait. So we've actually clearly established carrier and that the call is not clipped. So we don't waste that call.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. It is quite important also just to briefly pause and monitor prior to transmitting, just to guard against accidentally transmitting across another broadcast that might be happening at the time. So that's the standard radio broadcast, and some good comment there in terms of the formatting. And as I said, you'll find that in the advisory circular related to Part 91, which is the universal operational regulatory part that applies across the board for all types of operations, and that came in on the 2nd of December last year. And you'll find the plain English guide version of that on the CASA website, which is easy to read and understand. And if you comply with what is in the Part 91 PEG, you'll be compliant with the regulatory requirements. Let's have a look at an actual standard broadcast as an example. So we have a broadcast here that might go in this particular fashion. So, you know, Point Cook traffic, Cessna 172, Alpha Bravo Charlie, 10 nautical miles west inbound, Point Cook. So you can see that it's in the standard format in the right order, and we'll get used to broadcasting this type of way. It flows really quite nicely. I might ask Stefan, do you find that the location and the intention might be a bit of an issue, particularly for students learning, for example, in their earlier period of learning to fly, in terms of, say, giving an accurate position in terms of their location?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the biggest issues, particularly with our international students that might have a bit of a difficulty with English. Sort of struggle to, I think they try and get a little bit too specific with exactly where they're coming from. A common thing that it would be a pet peeve to a lot of instructors is with a simple 10 nautical mile call, some students might try and get too specific, and they'll have a look at their GPSs and they'll say something like 10.7 nautical miles inbound. They'll try and get a little bit too specific with their location in terms of, you know, coming west, east, north, or, you know, west, east. And they start to just confuse themselves a little bit. And then obviously the pilots that are already in the CTAF as well. Another one is also definitely on departure calls, specifying what direction you are departing in rather than actually giving a specific township. Because this might be all good for local pilots. If you depart an aerodrome and you say tracking overhead for Bendigo, for example, a lot of pilots might not know where Bendigo is, specifically international students. So it's a lot better to actually give a specific direction and altitude you're departing in, rather than just a geographical point that a lot of pilots might not be aware of. Yeah, it's one of the areas that we try and negate as much as possible, or we try and cover as much as possible on the ground before we actually send students solo. And that includes aircraft types as well, as you and Neil mentioned before. It's an item that will actually cover off with students on the ground before we actually do solo checks with them. And it's an item that's actually prevented students going solo if they don't actually know their aircraft types well in advance, because we have had plenty of incidents where students cut off traffic because they're following the wrong type of aircraft because they don't know the differences between a Piper Warrior and a Cessna, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. I think one of the issues we've found travelling around the country is you know, pilots might use the term approaching, you know, a particular position, for example. And I know my colleagues in air traffic control have particular issues with this, and you know, other pilots would as well, because I mean, what does, you know, the term approaching mean? You know, as we used to say in air traffic control, you know, if you you know, departing out of Moorabbin, for example, or you're inbound to Moorabbin, you approaching Moorabbin might mean you're 50 miles from it. It could mean you're 10 miles from it. So in terms of accuracy, it's a good idea to give a direction and a distance, even if that's from a topical feature, ground feature. At least pilots will know precisely, and air traffic control for that matter, will know where you are in terms of that particular location. So that's quite important, I think, as well. If we go on and have a look at the requirements in terms of broadcasting, now there's a bit of a difference between what the law requires in terms of the regulations and what might be required in terms of operational best practice. Now, the slide that you can see there is an extract out of the Part 91 Plain English Guide. And it essentially says that aircraft at or in the vicinity of a non-controlled aerodrome, including a certified or military aerodrome when they're not controlled, that in the situation where you consider it reasonably necessary to broadcast to avoid the risk of a collision with another aircraft, you're required to broadcast on the common traffic advisory frequency. So that's the legal basis of your requirement to broadcast. So it's the application of that creates a bit of an issue, because by law you need to broadcast when you consider it reasonably necessary to do so to avoid the risk of a collision. So it depends really on the circumstances that you're in and your discretion in terms of being the pilot in command as to when you broadcast in these circumstances, for example. So that's the basis of it. So let's have a look, if we go on and have a look at the next slide in terms of what this might mean practically. So when it's considered necessary to avoid the risk of a collision, possibly when you're in these circumstances, or in this circumstance, for example, when you're in the vicinity of a non-controlled aerodrome, pilot should make the following minimum positional broadcast in terms of the application of that previous rule that we just had a look at. So there are three basic situations there. So taxiing inbound at 10 nautical miles, or as Stefan said earlier, a bit earlier than that, 15, 20 miles, or if you're overflying or in the vicinity, operating in the vicinity, for example, of an uncontrolled aerodrome. So how do you, I might go to you, Neil, and ask you, the way do you teach the requirement to broadcast to recreational pilots? How do you see these three types of situations? Do you sort of see them as really being required from a practical and risk point of view?
Thanks, Michael. Well, I think the first thing is that in order to operate in an alerted see and avoid environment, we have to confirm the serviceability of the radio. And the best time to do that is actually pre-taxiing, or as we're taxiing. So taxiing creates that initial alert phase for pilots. So yes, I think, clearly there's been a lot of very intelligent thought gone into what should be a recommended call. And taxiing indicates to any aircraft user, obviously within line of sight, and that would be particularly that other aircraft are aware, hey, there's an aircraft that I now have to add to the situational mix. Inbound 10 nautical miles or earlier, Stefan's rightly said, it's a time-based thing. So performance could vary from 250 knots down to a parachute, which might be doing 10 knots. So the decision to make that call is based around the time, because the time is what other pilots are trying to manage in terms of separation. Absolutely important. And overflying or in the vicinity, as in transiting, important because it gives a bit more situational awareness for departing and arriving aircraft that may be coming from the same quadrant, as to how to separate. A point I just mentioned earlier in the comments was that in the position report, it's also important to broadcast your height, because a pilot needs to make a three-dimensional assessment as to whether that's a threat and what action they may need to take to ensure separation through alert, see and avoid. Does that answer the question, Michael?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. It's a good point, actually, too, when you're giving your location and intentions. It's a good idea to state or report your current altitude, and be it maintaining or on descent or climbing out on departure, because that will then also be a good reference for other pilots to indicate where they might be looking. So they listen to your altitude, they might have to look low, they might have to look higher than they currently are. So it is a good idea to state that, particularly when you're inbound, or indeed if you're overflying an uncontrolled aerodrome. Would you agree with that, Stefan? Is that something you would teach your students?
Yeah, definitely. And this goes into one of the next seminars about the situational awareness and planning everything before you actually get to the aerodrome. You know, another pet peeve is, you know, simply just listening to the CTAF frequency well before 10 nautical miles, because a lot of pilots they'll have the frequency set ready to go, but they won't actually switch over to make their call and listen to the frequency until that 10 nautical mile mark. And what happens then is you might have a whole plan in your head in terms of which runway you're going to join, whether it's a left-hand circuit, right-hand circuit, how you're going to join the circuit. But as soon as you start listening at 10 nautical miles, there's already another pilot in the circuit using a different runway, doing right-hand circuits as opposed to 10 left-hand circuits. And that completely changes your plan, and everything starts to snowball from there, and it's just an incident waiting to happen. So yeah, definitely just, you know, obviously it depends on whether you've got 2 comms on board or 1 comm on board, but if you do, just trying to apply a little bit of situational awareness and trying to set everything up and plan well before you actually get to the aerodrome 10 nautical mile boundary, before you actually start listening to the frequency. And then, yeah, the whole overflying thing as well. A lot of students struggle with when they actually are in the vicinity of the aerodrome and required to make a call to the aerodrome. A lot of our students presume that it's only when they're directly overflying the aerodrome as opposed to being within that 10 nautical mile boundary, where they might just need to make a courtesy call and letting everyone in the CTAF know that overflying, or, you know, 8 nautical miles to the north of the aerodrome at 4,000, just letting them know that they're at least within the vicinity rather than just making it when you're overflying.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. Sorry, there's a couple of good points there, and on one of the previous slides we saw that it's important to select the appropriate frequency early, because as Stefan says, it does take time to build situational awareness. So you can't expect to immediately switch to a frequency, make a broadcast, and then expect to know exactly what's going on. You certainly have to monitor the frequency for a little period of time to get to know what might be conflicting with you and what traffic is there, what they're doing, etc. So it is important, I think, to make these 3 calls, broadcasts, if you like, in terms of the application of the requirement of being in the risk of a collision. And I guess the underlying fundamental principle of making these broadcasts is, unless you make a broadcast when you're taxiing out, or you're inbound, or you're overflying an uncontrolled aerodrome, and then listen for the responses that you might get from that, you don't really know whether you're, you know, potentially at risk of a collision or not. So it's the, you know, that basis will set the scene for determining whether you're likely to be in conflict with other traffic or not. And the earlier you do that, as Stefan says, the better chance you'll have at building your situational awareness and being able to accurately project ahead and work out what might be going on. So,
Michael, sorry,
ahead,
just Terry,
ahead,
just
Terry.
some of the discussion points that are coming up that the panel might want to discuss is just on the inbound call. You know, we've got there that, you know, it's 10 nautical miles or earlier, depending on your performance of the aircraft. I guess the other thing that people are coming up with at the moment is an altitude, and if you're on descent, I suppose it's going to make a difference as to what altitude you're at. If you're just maintaining that altitude, that's going to make a difference as well. I just sort of trying to answer most people on the chat, but remembering these are the minimum positional broadcasts, and that you're making a broadcast to increase other people's situation awareness based on your own situation awareness. So if you hear an aircraft taxiing and they've made a taxiing report that they are going to be departing to the south, and you know you're coming in from that direction, you may want to sort of add, I suppose, at the inbound call, both altitude, which is really nice to know, and also, you know, possibly your intentions too. You know, what are your intentions based on the fact you're 10 nautical miles out? You're going to be there in a couple of minutes, and certainly I would provide an arrival time if I knew that accurately, and what my intentions were on arrival too. So I'll maybe just pass that to the instructors if they want to have a bit of a chat to that, because that seems to be a bit of a theme going through the chat at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. And one other point I'd like to make just quickly as well, and we've had some chat there about IFR operations around in and around uncontrolled aerodromes. It is an issue when IFR pilots use particular terminology that might relate to their instrument flight rules operations. So we always encourage IFR pilots when they're broadcasting to just simply state their location in terms of bearing or direction and distance and altitude, as we've all been saying, so that the VFR pilots operating in the general area have an idea of where that traffic's likely to be and what their intentions are. But certainly that those location and intention segments of a broadcast should contain an altitude and some increased detail in terms of the intentions of your particular operation, so that other pilots can know exactly where you are, what level you're at, know where to look, and then what your intentions will be from that point onwards. I think the next slide sort of takes us in to that area, which we'll have a look at. So this is
sorry, Michael.
Yeah,
I just wanted to something that was mentioned in the chat by Chris. Thanks, Chris.
Absolutely.
A really important point if we make a taxiing call is that a lot of airfields are surrounded by hangars, and you may not get VHF line of sight. So there's the previous recommended calls talked about entering or crossing an active runway. I think one of the things that you have to make a decision is that if you haven't been able to test and tune or confirm two-way communications, it's really important that if you've got multi or conflicting runway operations, like a lot of ALAs and LAs have, that entering or crossing an active runway also becomes an important call that, while not mandatory, certainly is enhancing the chance of reducing a potential collision either on the ground or in the air. And we see that a lot at a number of aerodromes around where I operate.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Some good points. But yeah, as we said, I think most IFR pilots are aware that they should be broadcasting location in language that pilots under the VFR would certainly understand, and to give them some chance of being able to sight the traffic and avoid that. While we're on that point of sighting the traffic, in terms of the alerted, see and avoid, ATSB did some research quite some time ago. I think it was published in a report in 2005, and you'll be able to find this on the ATSB website if you care to go and have a look. And that they have found through research that being alerted to the presence of other traffic through a broadcast increases your chances of sighting and avoiding that traffic by 8 times, so 80%. So that's quite a significant increase in the likelihood that you're going to sight and avoid other traffic because you've been alerted to the fact that they are there. So that's why broadcasting is critical around uncontrolled aerodromes when you'd have air traffic control issuing instructions, passing you traffic information, and that type of thing. The slide that I have up currently is, I guess, operational best practice when you're operating around other traffic. So these calls are useful in certain circumstances if you're at risk of a collision, or you're sort of unsure of what might be occurring in your general area. So things like entering the runway, joining the circuit, and joining the circuit in a standard way. So that might be joining via a midfield crosswind. It might be joining via an extended down into the downwind leg directly. As it says there, you are entitled to make straight in approach. Need to be established on final by no later than 3 nautical miles. It's not a recommended way of entering a circuit. Neither is 0.4 joining on the base leg, but strictly speaking, you are able to do that. There are advantages and there are also disadvantages to those types of circuit joins. During instrument approach, of course, at other locations, as best you can determine with other traffic, and possibly when you're clear of the active runway after landing. So these calls you know, although sort of not mandated by the regulation as such, if you're concerned at being potentially at risk of collision, then particularly in a busy terminal area, then quite perhaps you should be making these additional calls as operational best practice to clarify your particular intentions, if you like, and it'll give you the ability to sight and avoid other traffic as well. But there is a difference between you know, what's mandated by law and how you apply that in terms of operational best practice. So this is what we sort of recommend, I guess, from that point of view. So there's quite a few more calls that that you could possibly make if the circumstances warrant that. Which sort of, I guess, takes me to the next slide in a moment, with where we've got some of the general issues that we might see in terms of broadcasting. I might just add that before we move on, doing things like a straight-in approach and joining via directly onto a base leg, you're required to give way to traffic that's already established in the circuit at that particular aerodrome, and I certainly would be including information like that with the location and intentions with your broadcasting, so that other traffic know precisely how you're going to enter the circuit, particularly if it is sort of in a way that is a little bit different to a conventional or standard way of entering a circuit, for example. Under those circumstances, that might require additional broadcasting as such. If we go on and have a look at the last one of the last slides that we have this morning, these are sort of issues that we have been finding around the country as we travel around. For example, in terms of the system, nothing is perfect. We have pilots that for some reason might not be broadcasting. There might be inadequate radio broadcasts for the circumstances that are occurring, so they might be too infrequent, for example. We've seen examples of over broadcasting, so broadcasts that may be too frequent, and instead of contributing to situational awareness, they might just contribute to frequency congestion, for example. We have pilots that have, through the best of their intentions, are broadcasting on perhaps an incorrect frequency. We have non-standard broadcasts. Non-standard broadcasts are broadcasts that might be made in a different order using different terminology, and they make it difficult for the receivers to sort of understand and contemplate and work out how that might be impacting on their particular operation, and at an altitude that might conflict with operations at the aerodrome. And I think that has been raised over the last 45 minutes as such. So I might just sort of, in a way of concluding, ask Neil, do you have issues with pilots determining at what altitude that they might be conflicting with operations at a particular aerodrome, as an example?
I think it's a great question, and I think one of the issues we have about this whole issue of radio broadcasting, not so much the phraseology that we're focused on today, is there's been a number of changes over probably close to 20 years from the original AMATs back in 2003-4, and the vertical dimension of a non-towered or a CTAF or an MBZ. I see in the chat a lot of people have talked about 5,000, 3,000. The Multicom debate came up a few years ago. Look, I think at the end of the day, building a situational picture, it's particularly where we're seeing complex and diverse operations at non-towered or non-controlled aerodromes, it indicates that the vertical dimension, it's hard to put one limit on it. And I think that the key is we have two eyes 2 ears and 1 mouth. And if we apply that 80% rule to building the situational picture, that includes the vertical dimension along with people broadcasting their height and their intentions appropriately, I think then we can determine what vertically in the vicinity is a problem. But it's an area that I think CASA and the industry needs to continue to educate on, because there have been a number of changes in expectations, and culturally I think this is what we're trying to address with this series.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, some good points. We find that yeah, it does create a little bit of concern, and there are some legacy issues associated with this, as you said earlier on, when we used to have a mandatory broadcast area, and you know, they came with volumes of airspace. For example, they had lateral and vertical limits, whereas a common traffic advisory frequency, for example, is simply just that. It's a frequency. It's not a volume of airspace. So there's sort of no real lateral or vertical volume to a common traffic advisory frequency. The airspace is class G or uncontrolled, and although there is, and we'll see in the next webinar, in the second webinar of the series, that there is certainly a definition for in the vicinity of an aerodrome, which we will go into in a little bit of detail in the second of the seminars in this series. You know, it is up to the pilot and command in terms of their discretion as to whether really they're going to conflict with traffic at a particular altitude, be they inbound or overflying, or certainly on departure, and knowing when best to switch from the common traffic advisory frequency to the area aviation frequency, or vice versa, while you're inbound, for example, and when to make those broadcasts. So we do find that there is a bit of an issue from that point of view, primarily because there's no real volume associated with the common traffic advisory frequency. Just in finishing, would you, what recommendations would you make, Stefan, to your students, for example, in trying to determine that, you know, question of altitude and conflicting with other traffic?
Yes, as Neil said, it is a bit of a grey area. One item that we do emphasise quite a lot is being aware of what it says in the IRSA as well. So even though there might be specific rules as far as the AIP is concerned, specific aerodromes might have their own rules in terms of what altitude it's recommended you should enter at or overfly. Some aerodromes might not want you to overfly a certain at a certain point of the aerodrome at all, whether it be because of terrain on one side or noise abatement procedures for a township. So yeah, and as someone said in the chat before as well, it's just important to speak up when you're not sure as well. So as much as we can try and teach every scenario and situation under the sun, it's just important that if something doesn't go the way you plan it to go, that you're just able to speak up in plain English when you need to other pilots in the area. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's, I guess the bottom line is if you're unsure and, you know, you're concerned about conflicting with other traffic, then you should certainly monitor the frequency and broadcast your location and intentions, just to clarify any doubt that you might have. And of course, that altitude, an appropriate altitude, that can vary under the circumstances. You could be overflying or inbound or departing out of an uncontrolled aerodrome with jet air transport traffic, for example, like Mildura in Victoria, like Ballina in northern New South Wales, where you get Qantas Link and Qantas and Virgin and Jetstar operating into and from those particular aerodromes. So that might necessitate broadcasting earlier in terms of thinking, well, yeah, it is potentially a conflict, so I really should broadcast and clarify what it might be that I you know, need to do in terms of building my essay, and that'll come up in the next in the third and the fourth webinar in this particular series about establishing that more critical situational awareness, particularly in the terminal area of an uncontrolled aerodrome. So look, that takes us to the end of this the presentation phase of the seminar. We've been going for just under an hour now. So what I might do is, if people have questions that they would like to ask, you can either ask the question in general terms, or you can direct it at either Neil or Stefan or myself or Terry, for example. So I might get Landy to unmute microphones if she could, so that people are able to ask those questions if you haven't already done so in the chat room, and we'll do our best to answer any question you might like to ask now.
Microphones are enabled. You'll just need to unmute your microphone if asking a question.
Thanks, Landy. So while people are having a think about that, the Pilot Safety Hub, as I mentioned earlier on, has been commissioned now by CASA. You'll find it on the CASA website, or you can go to casa.gov.au/pilots, and that'll, in the URL, type that into the URL, and that will take you directly to the Pilot Safety Hub. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask?
Yes, I have a question. Delta Hotel, Dr. Hughes.
Yes, Dr. Hughes, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Look, could I make a suggestion? I was having trouble hearing a little of your example of a good and clear radio call. Could you please repeat that slowly so that everyone could hear that?
Yes.
A typical call coming in or departing, please.
Yeah. Okay. So it was to do with the format, the standard radio broadcasting format of location, traffic, aircraft type, your call sign, position and intentions, and location. The broadcast example that I've got, which was a very brief one, was something like Point Cook traffic, Cessna 172, Alpha Bravo Charlie, 10 nautical miles west inbound, Point Cook. So you finish with the location. But as we mentioned in the chat, when we're talking about location, position and intention, for example, it's a good idea to include altitude into that, so that other pilots would know where to look vertically. For example, do they look high? Do they look low? Given the location that you've given them. And intentions could also include things like your estimated time of arrival over the aerodrome and the method or procedure that you're going to use to enter the circuit pattern. So I'll be joining via a midfield crosswind. I'll be joining via an extended downwind. I'll be making the 45-degree intercept of the downwind leg. So does that make it clearer for you now?
Thank you. Yes, it does. And just one other quick question, if I may. If other people have got questions that's not exactly important, but there's a possible.
Sure. Sorry, you've dropped out. I can't hear you. You've cut out.
Michael, just while we're getting Dr. Hughes back there,
go ahead, Neil.
A simple thing from a training point of view, and Stefan might have some input to this, is when we first teach pilots to get this into their head, it's who are you addressing, who are we, where are we in that three-dimensional picture, and what are our intentions? And then you apply the standard phraseology to that scenario, and I think they're the anchors that allow you to start to build that repetition, so that those key words of alerted in the alerted, seen, avoid become relevant to everybody you're broadcasting to.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Dr. Hughes, are you back with us?
I think yes. I don't know what happened. I just dropped out for a moment.
That's fine, no problem.
My extra question may just be sort of superfluous, but in some clubs they have gliding operations. Could you just tell me what if you are a glider pilot, how that might alter your clear radio call, please? Because you can't, in a glider, of course, you can't always maintain your height, and your manoeuvrability is not as easy as a powered aircraft.
Yeah. Neil, could I direct that one at you? You might have a little more insight into that from a recreational
yeah,
point of
no,
view.
I'm a current gliding instructor and have been for 40 years. So I see John Welsh is here. Welcome, John. Gliders are aircraft like any other aircraft. The fact that they may be conducting slightly different circuit shapes, patterns, joining and on descent constantly doesn't really rule out the standard phraseology. And I think Michael pointed out the importance of this in slide 1, and that is if you identify the aircraft type, as in glider, then pilots should be aware that those aircraft are on a constant descent, that won't be able to fly a larger circuit, and they certainly have right of way under the regulations in terms of circuit traffic. So the standard phraseology still applies, and I think it's important that we don't think that a powered parachute or a glider or a trike or a hang glider could make different calls. I think it's important that we expect the same format, so we grab those key words to get that situational awareness picture right.
Yes, I've been flying for a long time, and I absolutely agree that the aircraft type, it needs to be clear for other pilots listening in. That glider call is a good example, I think, but I couldn't agree more, because as you said, there's 140 or 150 different types of recreational aircraft these days.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hughes. Yeah, a good point, and thanks, Neil, for the response.
Oh,
Do we have?
And thank you for the
any
seminar.
other?
Thank you for the seminar. It's really good.
Pleasure. Thank you. Any other questions? Quickly, just noting the time. Just
Neil, Stefan and Neil, can I ask one of you blokes as full-time flying instructors? Just can you hear me all right?
Yep. Go ahead.
One we haven't addressed, and maybe Michael, you consider it not part of the webinar, but calls in the circuit. And I think this is a legacy one that in 2005, CASA came out and said you should. They never said must. Should call on downwind, should call on base, should call on final. And pilots, instructors just embrace this idea that, great, I get to hear the sound of my own voice 3 times in the circuit. CASA rescinded that within about 2 or 3 years. But can you get people to unlearn that, to call on downwind, on base and on final? And so often it's either there are lots of aircraft in the on the frequency and you're just cluttering it up, or there are no aircraft on the frequency and there's no point in emphasising your communication above your aviation. That's over transmitting. What are your views on that, Neil and Stefan? Do you think people do it too much?
Stefan, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I agree. It is a difficult one, and I'm not sure in terms of exactly what's stipulated in the AIP, whether it's just making base calls. In general, we have our SOPs, our standard operating procedures in our actual school, where we make our calls, obviously our inbound call, our joining call, so joining midfield crosswind, and then from there on CTAFs, it's generally base calls. And then, yeah, but certain aerodromes will have URSA procedures as well. Like I know when we fly into Mangalore, it is stipulated with circuit and the traffic that you make downwind calls, base calls, and final calls, and you stipulate your number that you are within the sequence as well. So that's generally what we teach, is trying to make calls as often, well, basically on downwind, base, and final. But you're absolutely right, and when it comes to a point where you've got 5 or 6 aircraft in the circuit, it just becomes a battle for who gets to make a call when. And like you say, it just becomes a contest of who can get a call in first, and it just becomes more of a detriment to situational awareness than an actual improvement. So it is an area that probably needs to be looked at a little bit more in terms of what the actual required call is and when you make it, and how much the situation should impact that as well in terms of how many aircraft are in the circuit. So,
yeah, I've definitely got my own views, but I won't clutter up the chat with them now.
Thanks for the question. Appreciate it. Anybody else with a sort of a last question? We'll take, say, I think one more, noting the time. Okay, I don't have anything else, and be there no further questions, and noting the time, we might conclude the first of these series of 4 seminars. If you're interested in tuning in for our next one, it is next Tuesday, the 27th of this month, at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. So we're just varying the time a little, just to allow people to get to it if they've been busy in the morning. That webinar will be on using radios in Class G airspace, and we'll talk about things like frequency selection, monitoring the requirement for carriage of radio and non-radio aircraft. So if you're interested in that type of thing, stay tuned. 2 p.m. next Tuesday afternoon, the 27th of September. Thank you so much for everybody for joining in with us this morning. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope it was educational. If you have any further questions that might crop up, you can send them into a general inbox, email inbox. It's safetyadvisor@casa.gov.au. If you would like to ask further questions relating to the seminar, send a question via that particular email address, and that will then get sent to one of our safety advisors around the country, particularly if it relates to a specific location, for example. So once again, thank you everybody for being with us today, and hopefully we will see you next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Thank you, and bye-bye.